Okay, I hope you all had a moment to relax, and now we are back here together with the lecture. Let's continue with our hypothesis. So, we know already our hypothesis describes the relationship between two variables. And now when we look on this on an abstract conceptual level, we have an independent variable that influences our dependent variable. So we have a cause that influences an effect. So it could, for example, say, I have a light switch here. I assume the light switch turns the light on here. So my independent variable is the light switches, and I have a dependent variable that I assume they turn the light on. And now I can conduct an extremely simple experiment. I can press the button and have a look what happens. And I might find an effect, or I might not find an effect. And actually, this is the same when we conduct experiments looking on user interfaces. We could say our independent variable is the layout of our website. We might have several layouts we would like to compare, and then we assume they have the layout has an influence on the time the user needs to find specific information. But, so this is the case we would like to have, but unfortunately, often the world is not as easy as it looks like. There might be other things influencing the result. So there might be confound variables, as we call them. Simply other effects might influence the result of our experiment. Do you have any idea if you would conduct an experiment like this, what could influence the user performance besides the actual website layout? Let's assume you don't have restricted the user in any other direction. You just say, oh, I have layout A with the navigation, and I have layout B with the navigation. And what then might happen, users might perform your task on different devices. And then some users might perform very well on design A, and others might perform well on design B, simply because, for example, one are doing it on a mobile phone, others doing it on a desktop screen. So when we conduct experiments, we have to carefully think about what could be influencing our results, and think about how we handle this. And there are two approaches to it. Either we should eliminate them. So instead of saying, oh, please perform the task on your device, I could invite people to a lab saying, please perform the task on my screen. Then I know all the screens are the same. But in particular, when we conduct user studies remotely on the web, we cannot influence on what kind of device or what kind of parameters around. So then the most important thing is actually to control as much as possible or measure what kind of other influences might be around. So at least report on what other influences are there. So simply you could log the screen resolution. And the other approach would be then simply scaling up your sample size, that you can say, okay, there might be distribution in some parameters, but our sample size is big enough that we do not have to care about this. So when we look on our independent variable in human-computer interaction, and that's the same when we look on web technology, our independent variable is a piece of technology. So either different designs of a web page, different input modalities, different screen sizes, things like this. And now when we come back to our example of a web shop, you might say, oh, wait a moment. If we test this at the end, so we need to develop two different layouts in the full functionality just to check which one is better and then throw one away. That's too expensive. And there you're totally true. So simply, we can also test things simply before we have the full product implemented. And therefore, we use prototyping techniques. We have to think about what kind of research question we have and what kind of prototyping method are the best matching one. So there are low fidelity prototypes So you could simply have sketches of your web page, of your menu, of your structure, of paper prototypes, and ask participants to perform certain tasks with them, or have a cognitive walkthrough with them, how they would perform certain actions on these paper prototypes. And the advantage of this approach is actually that the paper prototype, or in general a low fidelity prototype, it's extremely easy and quick to build. It costs you more or less nothing. And users are extremely willing to provide critique on the fundamental concept of your application. On the other hand, the disadvantage is actually that there's no functionality, so it's hard to identify errors in your implementation simply because there's no implementation. Also, reusing a paper prototype is kind of difficult, but on the other hand, it's so extremely easy to build, so it's not really needed. And not all ideas or concepts actually can be implemented as paper prototypes or low fidelity prototypes. So in particular, when you're sensing a lot of data, this might be then hard for the user to imagine how this would look like. On the other hand, you can also do high fidelity prototyping using an almost finished look and feel of your product, have all the text ready, but have a limited set of functionality available. So don't focus on the back end, for example, just have the front end. Don't have a login page, even if your web page would expect to have one because you handle user data. And then you can, with just implementing certain functionality, you can test them and check if the user is interacting with these functionalities as you expect this. So there you can actually test the look and feel. The user gives you feedback actually mostly then on the look and feel. And if you have more polished prototypes, actually users tend to not critique the fundamental concept of your application. So simply think also about what kind of feedback you are expecting. Use more rough, quick prototypes when you would like to know if the user's understanding the fundamental concept. And if you have more design questions, then use more high fidelity prototypes. And also then think about how much time you need to implement a high fidelity prototype. And as I already said, so you need more time. Feedback is then more focused on the look and feel instead of the overall approach. And when you look from this from a management perspective, often managers expect to see more or less the full product. So simply also here, you need to manage the expectations. But simply to underline the relevance of prototypes, you can conduct A/B testing on every step in your development process upwards. Also later on, you can have different implementations and just test small elements of the interface. So actually this is what big internet companies do all day long. For certain users, they show some small differences and then log how they behave different to the other users. But now when coming back to conducting an experiment, we have to think about our population, our target group, which we would like to focus on. So which kind of users do we have? Which kind of users would we like to improve the usability for? And then this might be, so for example, registered users, we have our service, and for all the users we have already, we would like to improve something. We could say also we focus on all the users on the web, or we say simply we focus on all customers, so also maybe not direct users, but other people paying for actually that others using the product. And obviously, we cannot test our application, our interface with all of our users, simply that it's not feasible. So we have to get a sample, so a subset of the population which represents all our target group. And this is also, again, quite tricky simply because how do you get a representative sample of your user group, of your target group? And there are different approaches to it. What you would like to have, you would like to have a random representative sample. And then you can say, okay, you use a convenience sample, you use people around in your environment, or you could say you invite people voluntarily to participate in your study. However, depending on what kind of technique you're using, you're introducing some sort of bias. So simply, when you voluntarily invite people to participate in your study, you will get people more willing to give feedback, more people reflecting on things, more people interested in technology. But simply, this is also something to argue for when you design your experiment. And then when we have our participants, we have our research question, then finally we can conduct our experiment. And there are different types of designs for experiments. Here today I would like only to discuss between group designs. We will discuss more in the HCI lecture, but simply for testing things on the web, between group designs are the most relevant. So let's assume again we have our two website layouts, and we assume one performs better than the other one. What we then can do, we take our sample, and then we show to half of the sample one layout and ask them to perform a task, and we take the other half of our sample and do it with the other layout. So here, every participant in our study just sees one layout and performs the task for this specific layout. And then during the experiment, we can collect all kinds of relevant data. So either we could measure the task performance, we could measure how many errors people do, or we could have afterwards questionnaires measuring the usability, but we could also conduct interviews, for example. And as soon as you have collected everything, all data is there, you need to think about actually how you analyze the data. So either if you have quantitative data, then you normally use descriptive statistics, so describe the results in means and standard deviation, and then prove your hypothesis using inferential statistics. If you have qualitative data, you have to analyze all the text, all the material manually. There are also different kinds of techniques, so either text analysis techniques, or you use, for example, affinity diagramming, so you try to get all different aspects noted, and then try to structurally analyze every interview or every study you observed. But this is just a quick overview, and we will discuss this more intensively in the HCI lecture. But also, if you're interested, there are a couple of interesting books. So focusing on all the aspects I just here briefly introduced to you. So, as I already mentioned, there's also the possibility to conduct surveys. And surveys help you actually to understand what is your user, your website visitor actually looking for, what is the relevance, the website for the user, all kinds of opinions you can check better in surveys than in a controlled experiment if you have not a clear idea that A or B could be better. And also when you conduct controlled experiments, you use survey kind of approaches actually to monitor, for example, demographic data of visitors, how old they are, what kind of profession they have, sometimes gender, sometimes where they are located. And then you would also like to know actually about their needs, preferences, and what kind of other websites, for example, they would like to see. And you can have open questions where participants can freely respond to, or you can have more closed questions where they have predefined answers, or what we often do, that you have a Likert scale, that you have a statement and people can agree or disagree to this. And I assume you have all seen this a couple of times, so sometimes the website says, oh, we would like to have your feedback. Would you be willing to fill in our survey in 2 minutes? And if you not have seen something like this, I showed you to you now here. Simply, I'm doing this lecture today also as part of my teaching training, and I would like to get your feedback about the lecture today. So I would like you to first reflect on the content we discussed so far. So there's a small exercise for you to think about what would be a good exam question about the lecture today. And then I have a couple of questions for you to rate the lecture and give feedback, mostly on Likert scales. And I would give you, therefore, again, 10 minutes, and then we continue. Thank you.
Can you monitor how many people are actually doing this?
I have no clue what will happen to my presentation, but